Have you ever stopped to think, what if your cat wasn't just a pet? What if in fact he was there for a reason you never even imagined? Stay with me until the end, because this story starts simply, but what you're about to discover might surprise you in a way that you may never look at a cat the same way again. She was an elderly lady, one of those who lived quietly, with a tranquil and predictable routine. She woke up early, made her coffee, calmly took care of the house, and spent most of her time alone. No frequent visits, no major events, just days that seemed the same as each other. Her only constant companion was her cat, an ordinary cat. At least that's what anyone would think at first glance. But there was something about him, something difficult to explain. From the start, that cat was never like the others. He didn't meow for attention. He didn't chase after random things. He didn't behave like a normal animal. In fact, he observed. He observed too much. There were moments when she felt his gaze fixed, intense, as if he were analyzing her every move, as if he understood everything, as if he were waiting. Have you ever experienced this? That strange feeling of being watched, even inside your own home? At first, she ignored it. She told herself it was all in her head, maybe loneliness. After all, cats are mysterious, aren't they? But over time, the behaviors started to become increasingly difficult to ignore. He reacted before things happened. Even before anyone knocked on the door, he was already staring intently at the entrance. Before an object fell, he was already moving as if he knew exactly what was going to happen. And sometimes, he would simply stare at empty spots in the house for long minutes, completely still, as if he were seeing something she couldn't see. And the most disturbing thing was how he seemed to understand everything she said. It wasn't just responding to simple commands. It was different. It was as if he sensed emotions, intentions, as if there was a silent, invisible communication between them. That house, which had once been simply silent, began to feel heavy, dense, as if something had been there all along, hidden in the subtext of daily life. But she never imagined, never even considered, that it could mean something bigger. Until that night. One night when the silence felt heavier than usual, when the air seemed strange, when even the cat behaved differently. And it was at that moment that everything started to make sense in the worst possible way, because that night, something finally came to claim what was his, and what happened after that is something almost no one is prepared to understand. And perhaps as you listen to this now, a part of you is remembering something, a strange look from your own cat, a behavior that didn't make sense at the time, but that remained stored in your memory, because when stories like this begin to connect with our reality, they cease to seem like mere fiction. And I'll ask you a sincere question. Would you completely trust something that's watching you all the time, in silence? If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below describing what has touched you the most so far. It could be a feeling, an experience, or even something you've never had the courage to tell anyone. Because when you share, you might end up helping other people who have also gone through something similar, and perhaps never understood. And if you're feeling that curiosity growing, that desire to understand what's really behind this story, go ahead and like the video. This shows that this type of content deserves to continue, that stories like this need to be told, and it helps the channel reach more people who also enjoy this type of mystery, emotional drama with sci-fi fiction, and supernatural elements. If you're not already subscribed, subscribe now, because what comes next will delve even deeper into this story, and you won't want to miss the upcoming details. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and continue bringing you stories that challenge your mind and touch on something deeper that we can't always explain. Because what that old woman was about to discover wasn't just about her cat, it was about something much bigger, something that may already be closer to us than it should be. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we go back a few steps in this story, we begin to realize that none of it came out of nowhere. In fact, the signs were always there, hidden in the details, behind the scenes of the routine, waiting for the right moment to make sense. At first, everything just seemed strange, not scary, not threatening, just different. The kind of thing you notice but choose to ignore because it's more comfortable to believe it means nothing. And that's exactly what she did. There were days when the cat would simply stop and stare at a specific point in the house for long minutes. It wasn't an ordinary look, it wasn't animal curiosity. It was fixed, intense, as if it were observing something real, something present, but completely invisible to anyone else. And the most unsettling thing wasn't the behavior itself. It was the feeling it left in the air. The silence grew heavy. The air felt different, as if, somehow, that look was revealing a hidden truth that she wasn't yet ready to see. Over time, other details began to emerge, small, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning when seen together. The cat avoided mirrors. Whenever it passed near one, it would turn away. At times it would even stop and stare at its own reflection, but not like an animal that recognizes itself or is unfamiliar with itself. It was as if I were reacting to something beyond the image, as if the reflection wasn't exactly the same as what was there. This was affecting her mind in a quiet way, because it wasn't something that could be explained with simple logic. It was the kind of thing that starts planting doubts, that affects how you see the reality around you. And when that happens, even if you try to ignore it, something inside you has already begun to change. And then came the disappearances. At first, she thought it was normal. Cats go out, explore, come back. It's part of their lives. But not that cat. He would disappear without a sound, without leaving a trace, and come back the same way. Sometimes in a matter of minutes, other times, hours, and always with the same behavior upon returning. Calm, silent, as if nothing had happened. But there was something different, something that couldn't be explained with words. It was as if, each time he returned, he brought something invisible with him. Not something physical, but a presence, a subtle change in the atmosphere, as if the house wasn't exactly the same afterward. And this is where the story begins to touch on something deeper, because when you put all these signs together, the fixed gaze, the behavior in front of mirrors, the unexplained disappearances, an inevitable question begins to arise. What if it was never just a cat? This is the kind of thinking that challenges our mindset, that forces us to break out of autopilot and face possibilities that we normally avoid. Because accepting this means admitting that there is something beyond what we see, something that may be happening right now, without us realizing it. And perhaps the most unsettling thing of all is understanding that she had several chances to realize. Several moments when I could have questioned, investigated, gone deeper. But like most people, she chose the most comfortable path, to ignore, because facing the unknown requires a difficult decision. It demands courage to abandon certainties and accept that not everything is under control, and not everyone is ready for that. But the truth always finds a way to come out, even if it happens in the most unexpected way, even if it's too late, because there was a specific moment, a breaking point, when all of that ceased to be merely strange and became impossible to ignore. An instant when the house itself, silent for so long, seemed to react, as if it were alive, as if it were trying to show something that had always been there. And it was at that exact moment that she realized she was no longer alone in the way she had imagined. She thought it was just a cat, until the day the house answered back. And what happened after, that it began to completely change her perception of everything, of the world, of reality, and especially of that which had been right in front of her all along, waiting to be understood. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything that had been happening up until then, the signs, the strange behaviors, that constant feeling that something was out of place, was just preparation. It was as if reality was gradually making way for something bigger, something that could no longer be ignored. And then, that night arrived. It wasn't an ordinary night. Even before anything happened, there was already a difference in the air. You know when everything seems too quiet? Not that peaceful silence, but a heavy silence, almost as if the atmosphere were holding its breath. That's exactly how it began. The lights in the house started flickering. First subtly, a slight flickering, something that could easily be attributed to an electrical problem. But then it became more intense. The lights trembled, flickering at irregular intervals as if responding to something invisible. And along with that came that unsettling feeling, as if she were no longer alone. The cat, which was normally quiet and observant, changed. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was paying attention, completely focused on something that couldn't be seen yet. His eyes fixed on a point in the room, and his whole body became still. There was no fear. There was no agitation. It was as if he were recognizing something, as if this was expected. And then came the sound. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was completely different from anything she had ever heard. a kind of vibration, low, constant, that seemed to pass through the environment and at the same time, echo within her mind. It didn't come from outside, it didn't come from inside, it came from somewhere impossible to identify. At that moment, her perception began to change. That was no longer just a series of coincidences, it was a contact. The feeling of presence intensified. It wasn't clear, but it was palpable. It was as if the room was being occupied by something that didn't follow the same rules as ordinary reality, something that didn't need to be fully visible to exist. And then, she appeared. Or rather, something began to take shape, an imperfect, almost distorted silhouette, as if it existed between dimensions, between forms. It wasn't entirely solid, but it wasn't just a shadow either. There was a presence there, imposing, impossible to ignore, something that carried a different energy, a silent authority. And the most disturbing thing wasn't the way it was done, it was the communication. Because there were no words, there was no sound, but there was an understanding. Somehow, it connected directly with her mind, not as a voice, but as a clear feeling, as information being transmitted without the need for language, an emotional, direct communication, impossible to block. And at that moment she knew, that wasn't there by chance. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't about her. It was about the cat. That entire journey, all the ignored signs, all the small revelations hidden in the details, were all leading precisely to that moment, as if everything had been carefully planned, as if an invisible sequence had guided each step to that encounter. The cat, still motionless, continued to look, but now there was something different in its gaze. It was no longer just observation, it was recognition, as if he were finally confronted with something that was part of his own origin. And that changes everything, because when you understand that what was by your side all along doesn't completely belong to this world, your way of seeing reality never goes back to what it was before. That was not just an animal, it never was. And the presence that was there made that clear, without needing to say a single word. There was a purpose, there was a connection, and above all, there was a hidden truth about to be fully revealed. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it was precisely at that moment, faced with that inexplicable presence, that something within her began to change. It wasn't just fear. It wasn't just surprise. It was as if her own perception was being adjusted, as if, for the first time, she was seeing beyond the surface of things. Communication continued, silent, direct, but now clearer, not in words but in understanding. And that's when the revelation began. Suddenly, almost overwhelmingly, she understood that that cat had never been just a cat, what she called a companion, who shared the silent days with her, who seemed like just another ordinary animal, was, in fact, something much more complex, much older, much more conscious than any human being could imagine. There was no doubt. He was an observer, or perhaps something even greater than that, a kind of guardian sent with a specific purpose, not by chance, not by coincidence, but part of something structured, thought out, organized behind the scenes of a reality that most people don't even consider to exist. And when that truth starts to fall into place, everything changes. The way he looked, the way he reacted before things happened, the disappearances, his behavior in front of mirrors, none of it was random. It was function. It was a mission. It was part of a system that operated on a level she had never realized. And this brings about an inevitable reflection. How many things in our lives seem ordinary, but hide a greater purpose? How many decisions, how many encounters, how many details that we ignore are part of something that lies beyond our immediate understanding? Because at that moment she wasn't just discovering something about the cat. She was being exposed to a hidden truth, something that changes the mindset of anyone who comes into contact with it. The entity, still present, conveyed more, not with haste, not with urgency, but with absolute certainty, as if that revelation were not optional, as if she needed to understand. The cat wasn't just there to observe, he was there for her. For some reason she still couldn't fully understand. He had been placed in that house, in that life, at that specific time, perhaps to protect him, perhaps to accompany him, perhaps to ensure that something happened at the right moment, and that completely changes the weight of the story, because it ceases to be something distant and becomes personal, direct, intentional, But at the same time, there was something even bigger behind it, something that began to reveal itself in a more subtle way, almost like a backdrop that gradually took shape. Because if he was an observer, then he wasn't the only one. This idea began to grow in her mind, almost like a seed that expands too quickly, and the more she tried to organize her thoughts, the more she realized that it completely surpassed the reality she knew. That was not an isolated case. It wasn't a one-off event. It was part of something much bigger, a network, a presence, a kind of invisible system that operated silently, unnoticed, monitoring, analyzing, perhaps interfering. And this generates an impact that is difficult to ignore, because it changes the way you see the world around you. It changes the way you interpret behaviors, coincidences, sensations. It changes the way you understand reality itself. And at that moment there, in that presence, she felt something she had never felt before. It wasn't just fear. It was awareness. The awareness that what seemed small was, in fact, gigantic. The realization that her life, her choices, her journey may never have been as completely private as she believed. And then, as if that information needed to reach the deepest point possible, came the final insight, the most disturbing of all. She wasn't just being accompanied by that cat. She was being watched, and she wasn't the only one. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after everything that has been revealed, after understanding that it wasn't just a cat, that there was a purpose, a presence, a hidden truth behind it all, the most difficult moment of all has arrived, the moment when knowledge ceases to be merely an impact and transforms into a decision. Because it's one thing to discover something that changes your perception of the world. It's quite another to have to act on it, and that's exactly what happened to her. The presence was still there, silent, firm, inevitable. There was no hurry, no aggression, but there was a certainty impossible to ignore. It was going to happen, regardless of what she felt, regardless of how much she wanted to deny it. And then, for the first time since the beginning of it all, fear gave way to something even stronger, attachment. Because at that moment all she saw was not an observer, not a guardian, not an entity sent with a greater purpose. He was her partner. He was the one who stood by her side on the quietest days, the empty mornings, the long nights when the world seemed too distant. He was the one who shared the space, the time, the solitude, and somehow filled what was missing. And losing that, it wasn't just losing a cat. It was like losing presence. It was losing the connection. It was like losing a part of one's own journey. And this is where the story touches on something profoundly human, because no matter how extraordinary the situation, when there's connection, when there's feeling, the reaction is always the same. She tried to stop it, even without fully understanding what she was fighting against, even knowing deep down that it transcended any logic or human control. She took a step forward, as if, for a moment, emotion were stronger than reality. The words came out almost uncontrollably, not like a logical speech, but like a plea, an appeal, something raw, true, coming from a place that doesn't seek explanation, only a solution. She begged, not for answers, but for permanence. And at that moment, everything seemed to slow down, as if time respected the intensity of that moment, as if even that presence understood what was happening. And then, something changed. The cat, which until then had been motionless, focused, almost distant, finally reacted in a different way. He looked at her, but it wasn't an ordinary look. It wasn't just the gaze of an animal. It was something laden with meaning, deep, conscious, almost human, as if, in that exact second, everything that existed between them was being communicated without a single word, as if there were no longer any barrier between species, between dimensions, between realities, only connection. And this has an impact that goes beyond logic, because when you realize that something understands you, truly, everything changes. The way you feel, the way you decide, the way you react. And in that look, there was something she had never seen before. It wasn't just recognition. It was a farewell, a silent, yet perfectly clear farewell, as if he knew that moment was inevitable, as if, despite everything, there was a path that needed to be followed, a mission that needed to be completed, something bigger than any attachment, bigger than any emotional decision. And this creates an internal conflict that is almost impossible to resolve, Because on one side there is the feeling, the connection, the need to maintain what makes sense, what brings comfort, what represents everything that is still familiar. On the other hand, there is the truth. And the truth, when it comes out, isn't always comfortable. She's here to transform, to shatter certainties, to force choices that no one would want to make. And at that moment, there, faced with that reality that could no longer be denied, she realized something that completely changed her mindset. She had no control. It never had one. And maybe it was never about having. Perhaps it was about acceptance. But accepting, in that context, seemed impossible. Because how can you accept losing something that has sustained you emotionally for so long? How can you accept that something that was once a part of your life was never truly yours? That was the question that kept echoing inside her, and the answer was yet to reveal itself in a way she hadn't imagined. Write this down. I would feel the same way. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything that happened up to that point wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was just the point where her reality began to completely fragment, as if two truths began to exist simultaneously. On one side, there was attachment, memory, everything that made sense within human logic. On the other, there was revelation, presence, and the certainty that something much greater was happening behind the scenes. And then, it happened. There was no explosion, no intense light like in the movies, no grand spectacle. It was subtle, silent, almost imperceptible, but absolutely definitive. The presence began to dissolve into the environment, as if it had never been fully there. The distorted form faded away, like an image losing its signal, and at the same time, the air in the house seemed to return to normal, or at least to what she had previously believed to be normal. But the cat was the central point of everything. For a moment he remained there exactly where he was, looking at her. That same look, deep, conscious, filled with something that cannot be explained with words. And in that second, it seemed that everything was paused, as if the universe were waiting for one last decision, one last gesture, something that could change the course of everything. But nothing changed, because some things simply follow the path that has already been set. And then, in a movement so smooth it could hardly be perceived, he disappeared. I am here, without a trace, without explanation. A void filled the space where presence had once existed, and it was in this void that the real impact arrived. Not as an immediate shock, but as a silent wave that gradually took over everything. The house, once merely solitary, now seemed different, bigger, more empty, more aware, and that changes everything, because it wasn't just absence. It was perception. It was as if, after all that, she had lost something, but at the same time had gained something that could no longer be ignored. A new way of seeing, a new mindset, a new awareness of the reality around her. But the story doesn't end there, because days later, something started bothering me again. It wasn't the cat. It wasn't the presence. That was the feeling, that same old feeling of not being alone. At first, she tried to ignore it. She told herself it was an emotional consequence, just the impact of it all. But over time, some details began to emerge, small, almost invisible, but enough to reignite the doubt. Objects out of place, shadows that seemed to move at the edge of the field of vision, and sometimes that same feeling of being watched. But now, without the cat, and that brought a new layer to everything, a new revelation. Because if he was an observer, and if he was taken, then the question that remained wasn't, why did he leave? The question was, different. Who else is here? And it is at this point that the story ceases to be just about her and begins to touch on something much broader, something that involves all of us. Because when you start to consider the possibility that there are presences, consciousnesses, entities operating beyond what we can perceive, everything changes. The way you interpret silence, the way you react to the unknown, the way you understand the small details of everyday life, and maybe, just maybe, some things you've already experienced will start to make more sense now. Because the most disturbing thing of all wasn't the disappearance. That's what came next. It was the invisible continuity. It was the constant feeling that this wasn't over. It just changed shape. And even today, they say she still lives in that same house, following her routine, maintaining her serene appearance, as if nothing had happened. But on the inside, everything changed. because some say that, even today, she still feels that she is not alone. And when you start connecting all these dots, when you really allow this story to go beyond the surface, a new question arises, inevitable, uncomfortable, but extremely real. What if we've never been there? Comment below. I feel the same way. And if you've made it this far, perhaps it wasn't by chance. Perhaps some part of this story has connected with something inside you, even if you can't yet explain exactly what. If this type of content makes you think, provokes you, takes you out of autopilot and leads you to a deeper place of reflection, then it makes sense for you to stay here. Subscribe to the channel, because that's precisely the idea, to bring stories that aren't just for watching, but for feeling, questioning, and sometimes even seeing reality in a different way. And tell me something, if you really followed everything to the end, write in the comments. I'm with you until the end. This shows that you were part of this journey until the very last second, and helps strengthen this space where these stories continue to happen. If at any point you felt that shiver, that doubt, or even that silent identification, leave a like on the video. It's a simple, yet powerful way to show that this type of narrative needs to continue reaching more people who are also looking for something beyond the obvious. And before you leave, there's a video here that perfectly complements this idea, bringing another story that might move you even more than this one. Click and stay with me there, because in the end, some answers only appear when we decide to continue.